We're live, and probably need to get my microphone closer to me. Um, you would think that I've made some videos. Some of them are successful. It created some controversy. There's a lot of discussion. I appreciate everyone that wrote anything, and you would think that by making another video that I'm trying to promote myself, and you would be wrong in the sense that there was so much stress around the fact that people actually watched my video, and then people that I thought I could trust that were like decent people turned out to be like shooting me down. And like one of the comments I didn't even see it because apparently it was like so rude that it was automatically like just not even shown to me, right? So I'm not trying to promote myself. What it is that I go off on these thought tangents, and so in starting with and finally tackling all of my emotions about like the Bay City Rollers, it went on all these tangents, and so I'm just trying to finish the tangents. And so in the last video, I said this is probably the last video about that particular subject matter. And in a way, it is because I'm moving on to a new subject matter now that is related and based on that previous video. A lot of thoughts came to my mind about music and producers and stuff like that. But before I start off, all of this really was triggered by this one thing that I have here. Because I had certain feelings about something. And then when I read this, an article in this magazine, it was like, I knew it. So as I've been saying, producers in the Bay City Rollers, like it was a huge problem for them and stuff like that. But here we have, this is Punk Magazine. This is from 1978, and the Sex Pistols tour is going on, and they're covering that, right? This is the May-June 78 issue, number 14. Okay, but the other thing that's in here is the Bay City Rollers, and I have this because the Sex Pistols are fine and stuff, but when I see that the Bay City Rollers are in Punk Magazine, I'm getting a hold of that. And the back cover actually has like the Rollers destroying people and like eating people up. And the byline on that one is a fan's true story. Now, some of the stuff in there is just made up. And I mean, it's Punk Magazine. This is the original, like Punk Magazine number 1, I think, has like Joey Ramones spray painting the wall on it. Like it's that. That's the original. This is the original thing, right? But what I really like about the article in here, first of all, they admit that the Bay City Rollers are as punk as it gets. And I agree with that 100%. But the other thing they mention is that the big problem that the Bay City Rollers have is producers. And so I was spending a lot of time talking about producers. So the theme of this video, and everything I've heard about every producer, every singer, every band that I've heard about, and it's not that much, it's a limited amount of information, but everything I've heard was kind of like going through my mind, and I started to realize something about producers. And so I want to talk about a few things. So I'm covering a bunch of stuff in here. I am covering a little bit of like the Bay City Rollers and their early producers, but I'm also going to talk about Black Sabbath. I want to talk about the Ramones. I want to talk about Phil Spector. I want to talk about Ronnie Spector. I want to talk about the Ronettes, because all of this stuff comes together. And I think it explains a lot of the early troubles that one of my favorite bands had, and the disintegration of that band as a result. And it puts us into a more healthy mindset instead of saying, oh, this person was bad, this person was good. I think we can actually look at it from a perspective of things changing over time in the music industry, right? So producers. I want to step back all the way into like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Okay. So in those early periods of recorded music, the producer was in popular music often taking care of a vocalist. So you have I don't care who it is, Billie Holiday, Frank Sinatra, stuff like that. In popular music, like in the hard jazz scene, it's a bit different. But generally, you have producers who have a vocalist, and they treasure that vocalist, and they want to make them sound as good as possible. And then they have musicians, and in a lot of cases they're just paying the musicians for their time, and they see the musician as someone that is replaceable. They're not key to this record selling. You got singers like Julie London. It's like, Julie's going to sell the record. You as a musician are replaceable. We want to have the best, but there's 10 levels of best for every single instrument that they have, and you have maybe a whole orchestra playing this stuff. And so it's kind of what I don't call it old school, I called it an old timey perspective of what the producer does. So the producer is very focused on that vocalist, and the people playing the instruments behind it are kind of interchangeable. um, what happened to start to change that was, you've got like Chuck Berry shows up on the scene, and his guitar is kind of like tied to the fact that he's also a vocalist, and he's writing his music too. Because in those earlier days of the producer, they're also, let's not forget, the singer is typically not writing the songs. They're getting their songs from a stable of songwriters. They're choosing standards, whatever, right? So you have the songwriter, you have the musicians, and you have the vocalist. And like I was saying, the producer is going to focus on that vocalist. The songs you can pick from anywhere, musicians can be replaced, right? And like I said, Chuck Berry comes along and changes that slightly, because you can't have Chuck Berry singing without his guitar and make it a hit, right? So Chess Studios, was not idiotic, and they understood this, and it was about Chuck and his guitar and piano and other stuff. But Chuck could go on tour, and he could have different instrumentalists behind him if he was going to France or whatever, and they would be aware of the music beforehand, and they would like just try to keep up with what Chuck is doing, right? And then you had the Crickets, right? So what I'm generally saying is that rock and roll is starting to break the mold of, there's a songwriter, there is an orchestra or something like that, and then there's a vocalist. Rock and roll is starting to change that. So then you have the Crickets, which later on everyone was like, well, it's Buddy Holly, So once again, it kind of like, he kind of rises out of it. He is the vocalist. He's the one that matters, right? And you also had Gene Vincent and his Blue Cabs, which had in a starring role, Cliff Gallup on guitar. And but Cliff Gallup left after the first two records. I don't really listen to the records after that, right? But other people do. But generally, what is happening is that old separation. I mean, you're going all the way back to classical music, where you have a composer, and then you have musicians that are just trained to play it, and then occasionally you have these star vocalists. If you're doing an opera in particular, you might have that, all the way up to this, and it's starting to disintegrate. But really, what put the final nail in the head of that, and this goes back to the first video that I made, is we talked about Motown and how, you had songwriters. I didn't really mention this. They also had musicians that were paid kind of by the hour. And then they had the vocalists who were kind of like the stars. Now, it did mix up a little bit in Motown, because you got people like Smokey Robinson, who is writing songs and also singing, right? I mean, he's just, I can't say enough good things about his musical abilities. I mean, he could do it all. But the thing that really put the nail in the coffin on this kind of thing and changed music for a few decades was the Beatles, right? And the reason for that is that you couldn't just take somebody out of the Beatles and replace them with someone else and then say it was the same band. It was something that wasn't really possible. And not only that, they were writing their own songs while they were playing covers. So everything starts to get mixed up. And this is why, when people say, oh, I don't think the Beatles were that great. I'm not saying people have to like their music, but there was a huge transition that happened as a result of that. You've got an entire band. Everyone knows who's in the band. They're writing some of their own music while they're doing covers, right? And then they have a producer. Thank God they have a producer that respects that, and they release these albums that sound great. But just because that happens doesn't mean that the entire world of production changes and everyone's like, oh, we have to respect the band. That doesn't happen, and it takes a long time. So one thing that I really liked about that interview with Les in the previous video that I did, where he was saying, the Bay City Rollers were launched with, Phil's production, studio musicians, and me as a vocalist. That was how we were launched. And the thing that I find interesting about that is that it kind of shows that Phil is of that older mentality of the producer, in the sense that he believed musicians are interchangeable. The vocalist is the person. Yeah, why does he love the vocalist? Let's step back. Why? Well, Les had a great voice. You could get it on the radio right away. There was absolutely nothing standing in the way of him getting on the radio, and it's irreplaceable. You can't just put someone in there to replace him, right? So it totally makes sense from the older mindset of what a producer is supposed to do, that he would go ahead and bring in some session musicians. The vocals are what it's all about. Probably because before the Beatles, I mean, that was just the standard for a lot of music. And it gets into this kind of area that still exists today, where you start to say, okay, well, what is the role of the producer and how has it changed over time? And what I would say is that there are two competing roles for the producer. So one would be that the producer is the god, much like an Italian film director is the person that, it's all about his vision, right? And I think that goes back quite a ways, right? And then I think there's this other vision of the producer, and that is that the producer's job is to essentially create the auditorium. So, with classical music, you have live performances where you have all the echo is great. And they've been working for centuries to create an auditorium that sounds perfect. So that's another role of the producer, is that you want to have this band play and you want it to sound great. So I think there are two different mindsets. And I think that one is kind of poisonous. And I'll say why. So when Les was saying, it was really about Phil and myself, that's driving a wedge between the band members, right? And I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a bit, about that wedge that can be driven between band members, and it can be very unhealthy. And I think it happens absolutely all the time. It happens all the time. So what you essentially have happening there is that the producer is interfacing with the vocalist and ignoring everyone else, right? Now, the fact is, through that, in that example, they created, I think, 3 singles that were hits, right? And it's a double-edged sword because we know, like for the Rollers in their instance, they wanted to be stars. I think most musicians want to be stars, but whatever. And so they're kind of getting that, but it's while sacrificing, you know, what the band actually is, right? And so in popular music, when you have that kind of mindset going on with the producers, it's like, yeah, you got your hit singles, but at the same time, is the album what you wanted it to be? And is your image what you want it to be? Right. But I'm going to take it a step further and I want to look at other bands. So I actually have to look this one up, but I have read about this before. Okay. Bear with me here. So, the Rollers had an excellent producer that could write hits and could get stuff out there, and it became hits. And he knew that he could trust this vocalist that they're going to do well. But the question becomes: is the album what you want it to be as a result? Okay, so you have a professional, you have hits. Okay, I want to compare that to something else. And the first thing I want to compare it to is the first Black Sabbath album. Okay. So this was produced by, I think, Roger Bain. And if anyone has ever heard that album, you know that it's one of the best recorded albums of all time. But did you know that he had very little experience, if any, in producing an album, right? And recording an album. And so this comes into the other important part of being a producer. And I've heard some very good producers say this. And what it really is just having an ear, right? So Black Sabbath had gigged a ton by the time they released this album, I think in 1970. And they went into the studio as good gigging artists with novices at the board, and they came up with something that sounded great. Why? Simply because the producer is using his ears to say, this sounds good, that sounds better, this sounds worse, for every single thing that's going on. And he's not interfering with who the band are. This is the band, this is what they're doing. My job, as a producer in this mindset is to make it sound as good as possible. And so I'm not sure how many hits came off of that album, but the thing sounds absolutely fantastic. And because the producer doesn't have like so much ego that he has to throw himself into it, they end up with an album that is an absolute classic that people, I mean, it's 1970. I mean, people still listen to this like so much today, right? The next thing I want to talk about is the Ramones. So the first, I think, like, let's just focus on like the first 3 or 4 Ramones albums, and I won't get into too much detail about it. But essentially, at first, Tommy Ramone is producing this stuff, and these are absolutely classic rock and roll records. The first four albums are, and but they weren't selling. So this is what I'm talking about with this double-edged sword. Well, do you bring in a producer then that's going to change everything? Someone who's not going to listen to the band, that doesn't care about what the band actually sounds like, but can give them a hit maybe? Or do you stick to your guns, right? And so I have a few things to talk about that I know that Johnny Ramone mentioned. And the first is that when they did the album Pleasant Dreams, so this is after their original, like, truly punk records, they did an album Pleasant Dreams, and there was a few problems with that. But one thing that I really like that he said was that they went into the studio and the producer turned to Johnny and he said, "There's a buzz coming from your guitar. Get rid of it." And Johnny knew, well, that's the death knell for this record being a punk record, because without having my guitar turned way up, without the gain being turned way up, we're not the Ramones anymore. And certainly they were not on the Pleasant Dreams album, the Ramones that everyone knew. um, and he wasn't happy with the album. I find it interesting because every song on the album is great. The production is a little bit slick. But even under those horrible circumstances, they managed to create a good album. They still didn't get any hits out of it, and Sire Records was getting fed up. And I put it all on Sire. Like, you have one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time, and you're not managing to sell their records. I'm not going to put that on the Ramones. Tommy did a great job. I mean, the first Ramones album changed the world, like, with the lyrics and the recording style and the vocals and the way they're playing guitar. It changed everything. If Sire Records can't sell that, that's their problem. So, um, you know, just to backtrack a little bit, we're getting to, essentially we have two different types of production. One that respects the band as a whole, the other that respects, like, the vocalist and thinks band members can be easily replaced and songs should just come from wherever you want to get them from, right? But another thing about the Ramones that I want to touch on is that they did have a film, not a film, sorry. There was a film afterwards. They did have an album that was recorded by Phil Spector. And I want to get into what happened when the Ramones started interfacing with Phil Spector, because it's the same thing that happened when the Bay City Rollers started recording early on. And that is that Phil Spector, according to Johnny anyway, went up to Joey and said, "You're the star. Your vocals are what make this band great." Now, why would he do that? Number one, I say he's one of those old timey producers, right? Who looks at the vocalist, they're going to be a star. Musicians are easily replaced, and songs can come from anywhere. It doesn't matter. But the Ramones wasn't that kind of band. So this put a wedge. This was poison, and it put a further wedge into the band. Because when you're in the band, the last thing you need to hear is that the producer is saying that the singer is great and nobody else matters, right? Now, having said that, Joey is, one of the greatest vocalists I've ever heard. Like, he had a style that you can't compare. But it's the band as a whole that really enticed me and why I bought all those early records. So we're talking about what happens with those old timey producers and their fixation with vocalists. And the other story I wanted to talk about also has to do with Phil Spector, and this is where it gets to the point where the person actually gets to a level of insanity. The person actually gets to a level of abusiveness. This is the old timey producer on steroids like no one's ever seen, gone completely off the rails, right? Phil married Ronnie Spector from the Ronettes and cherished her in the most, I can't even, it's hard to find an even, in the most unhealthy way that you could even imagine. and he sabotaged her career. And it's funny because, it's Be My Baby, and it's like, that also leads back to the Rollers because they covered that song. He sabotaged her career. He generally locked her up. He is the perfect example of that old-timey producer that falls in love with the vocalist to a degree where it's insanity because he can't let go of her. Because to him, this is the only thing that matters. And, she's she was beautiful as well. I mean, she really had everything. And so I'm not sure where I'm going with this point, but I'm just kind of saying that he is an example, of that older attitude. And I think that bands, and I'm going to get into modern music in a few minutes, even though I don't know a lot about it, but I know enough that I think I can say a few things. When a band signs a record contract and they get a producer, they have to think, do we want to be stars, or do we want to stick by our guns and have the sound that we've created and stuff like that? And in popular music, often you don't get that choice. It's all assigned to you, and it can be taken away. And you see this is the thing: the recording artists that survive for a long time, those are the strong ones, right? If they are people that can write their own songs and can prevent the producers from taking over the show, they're going to have, I think, much more longevity. The people that simply want to, rise to fame and allow someone else to have control are going to shoot up the charts and then disappear because they're not protecting their own interests. So I would say, and this is rather old school, but I'm saying if you're a recording artist and you're going to sign a contract or something like that, you need to find out who this producer is. Is this someone that's going to release his own songs through you and collect royalties through you where you get nothing? Right? Is this the kind of producer that thinks only the vocalist matters? The rest of the band is interchangeable and I'll just produce and bring in other people to finish it? Or is it a producer that says, yeah, I've been hired to produce an album by this band. Whether I like it or not, I'm going to make it sound like who they are, but it's going to sound as good as it possibly can. Right? Now, for me, that'd be like, that's the producer that you want because you want to do 5-10 albums. You don't want to do 3 songs by this guy and then have him disappear off to some other project. And then you're left sitting there with nothing that sounds anything like what he did, right? And you see this throughout the music industry all the time, where they have a producer and they're successful, and then that producer is gone, and suddenly they can't get a hit. They will never get a hit again, right? Because everyone expects that sound that wasn't actually them, right? So I would say it's important to choose the right producer and not allow any record company to force you to be produced by anyone. Okay. Now, all of that starts to fall apart anyway, and we don't care about it because in the modern era, you can produce stuff at home, right? And like I was saying before, the role of the producer is to provide that in modern music, is to provide that auditorium that exists for classical music that in rock and roll just doesn't exist. So a lot of it is technology. You've got things like reverb to make sure that things aren't dry. And then you've got like computers now and all kinds of effects that you can put in there that we've been using really all the way back into the 60s and 70s, And so it's the role of the producer to help out with that. And if someone can produce their own stuff and achieve that, I'm going to give you the perfect example. Kate Bush on The Dreaming. It's just out of this world, like what she achieved on that. She may have had a producer. I'm not going to pull out the record and check right now. But it was her vision, and she stuck to it to the end. And it's just incredible. Like the soundscapes that are going on. And then Hounds of Love, don't even start. Like it's just absolutely insane, right? So I think a band typically, if you don't want to be someone that does 3 hits and then disappears, you want a producer that actually listens to who you are. they respect the vocalists, but they also respect the musicians, and they respect your songwriting abilities, right? Because you're there for a reason. Like, you've got a contract. Why? Well, you can write some songs. Okay. But I think one last thing I wanted to touch on is, what is the modern version of that? What I was saying, old timey producer, and I think that kind of producer shows up in rap today and in the Nashville scene, right? And people can decide whether they think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't care. But I mean, in the rap scene today, the producer in some ways plays a bigger role than the rapper does. You know, and it becomes obvious when you listen to certain people that are produced by the same producer. It's like, yeah, that's his sound. It's not the rapper's sound. This guy produces this stuff. This is his sound, and then the rappers add a little bit of personality on top of it, right? And I think also in Nashville, they stick to that old school thing where people are picking up songs that are written by people that, their profession is to write songs. And, you've got these guys picking up these songs, guys and gals picking up these songs and recording them and trying to turn them into hits. And it may be that the producer brings in session musicians to say, well, we need, some slide guitar on this or whatever. And we're going to bring in all these people to help turn you into a star. And I don't think that's ever going to change in that whole scene, right? You have the rebels. You got people like Dwight Yoakam who comes along and causes causes some trouble for a little while. But I think that's going to stay there for a while. I mean, how long has Nashville been going on? I mean, it's crazy, right? So I think where I'm heading with this video is that everything sounded in that last thing where I was talking about the newspaper article, Bay City Fakers, right? And it sounded really awful, and you look at it and like, oh my god, all this stuff. But really, all it is a different mindset, and it's the mindset of a producer who says, I care about the vocalists. I don't care about the people playing instruments. I can just pay them. I'll just pay whoever to do that, and I'll get someone who's capable of doing it. It doesn't matter to me. And so it doesn't make it like there's, my point is, there's not a sense of good and evil. It's what the sense really is the sense of choice. And a lot of bands didn't understand that they had a choice. But that choice is, get a producer who's going to focus on just making hits for you. Doesn't matter who you are, right? Or get that producer that says, my job is to make you sound as good as possible doing what you do. So I'm never going to record anything professionally, but if I were ever to record something professionally, I'm going to choose that guy who says, Blaine, I want you to sound as good as you can writing your songs, right? So that's really what it comes down to. That last video just kind of like reminded me of all of these things, But I think the other thing to also say is that maybe you didn't make any hits. Let's look at it that way. And I have a perfect example, and it's a band I already mentioned. Maybe you didn't make any hits, right? So you're failures. Is that it? Well, look at the Ramones. The Ramones struggled throughout their entire career and had a few minor hits. They get played in at hockey games now. They play Blitzkrieg Bop, right? Johnny, through his entire career, earned a total of $1 million and then finally retired after gigging around the world for decades, right? But they created some of the greatest albums on the planet when they weren't being hindered by their producers. And I think that's okay. I wish that their music had been popular when they released it and they would have made money and not had to struggle. But, they survived. They made albums on their own terms several times, and they were great albums. And so it worked out for them in the long run, in my opinion. I mean, who doesn't know who the Ramones are now, right? And it's the same thing with Black Sabbath. I mean, if someone had come in as a professional to produce their first album, it wouldn't be a classic. The production might have made a hit, but the album wouldn't be a classic. It wouldn't have that depth that it has. So I think it's okay, is what I'm saying, to go your own way, even if it means that you might not be famous. I think it's the way to go. And I think most people know that today. And I think also a lot of people are just producing stuff at home like me. So that's kind of my feeling about producers. I'm sure there are other types of producers as well. Some that you want to stay away from, others that you do want to interact with. But these are two major things, and you want a producer that respects every member of the band and wants the band to succeed. That's what you're looking for. And that essentially is what leads to long-term success, because when that producer leaves, you're still you. You're still making great records, right? I think that's all I have to say. And I really hope, like I was saying, I'm not trying to create videos just because I had some that had a few watchers. Like, I'm trying to kind of tie this up mentally, like everything that happened to that band, and the sense of what's good and what's bad, like morally. I think it's very blurred when you start to look at the history of recording of music. But the recording industry can be very dirty. People get ripped off all the time. People have their ideas stolen all the time. It's a mess. But I think as far as producers go, those two main things are important to take into account. And I would say the producers that cared about the band and produced them as well as they could for what that band wanted to do created the best albums. I think there's no doubt about it. The people that tried to turn it into something else, maybe not as great. Anyway, that's my thought. Hopefully it'll last, but I'm not going to guarantee anything this time. Thank you for watching.